Welcome everyone to the Playbook for Ethical Technology Governance webinar. My name is John Clemay. I am the Director of Strategy and Growth here at Institute for the Future. And just to kind of set the table for everyone and go through a little bit of the agenda, we have a 45-minute window planned for this webinar. And the majority of the time will be Jake and Alana walking you through this playbook. But note that we will set aside 10, maybe 15 minutes for a question and answer period at the end, as I'm sure many of you will have some questions. So please write those questions in as you think of them, as they come up in the Q&A section below or the chat, whatever you feel more comfortable doing. So again, thank you. We appreciate you spending some time with us this morning, and wanted to first also give a quick shout out to the Tingari Silverton Foundation, who is a funder for this program. They're an Austin-based foundation. And also thanks to Lane Becker, who is an IFTF affiliate, and he is the co-author of this. So I wanted to say thank you to both Lane and the Tingari Silverton Foundation. And before we start, we'll ask you, in addition to your name and where you're from, is to enter into the chat what words come to mind when you think about ethics and technology. One or two or maybe three words come to mind. Jake and Alana will kind of pick a few of these out throughout, and perhaps not by name, just the words, so we don't embarrass anyone. But if you could put those words into the chat box, if you could, and that would be very much appreciated.
There are no kids present, so any words are acceptable.
There are no ratings on this particular webinar. And one other thing to note as well, to the group, after the webinar ends, hopefully at some point today, we will send a follow-up email to everyone who has registered for this webinar, and it will include the video of the webinar. So please forward that on to your colleagues or any other team members that perhaps were unable to attend this webinar today. So expect that email from us later today.
It's great to see all these phrases coming in. I recommend to save the chat. It's kind of interesting to look at this word cloud of ideas that come up from different people all over the world. So thank you for adding those.
Yeah. So I will quickly just give the overview of who we are, Institute for the Future. We are the world's leading and longest running futures organization, at least that we are aware of. We're a 53-year-old nonprofit based in Palo Alto, California. And we were started in the 1960s from a handful of guys that left the Rand Corporation, who were looking at what the internet might be used for someday. So pretty fascinating stuff that they were working on back in the late 60s. But today we work with many of the world's leading organizations, for-profits, nonprofits, foundations, government agencies, NGOs across the board. And our goal and our mission, and probably why we are a nonprofit, is we really want to help organizations to think systematically about their long-term futures, their preferred futures, and to help them to become future-ready organizations. And with that, I will pass the mic on to Jake, who will tell you about today's goals.
Yeah, we want to just introduce you to the Governance Futures Lab, what we're up to, who we are, and what we're up to. We're going to dive into the playbook itself, go through the structure of it, and also do a little some demos together to look at how it's used and how we designed it to be used as a tool to help think through ethical issues and governing those issues. And as I say, practice, get some hands-on practice doing that, and then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So the Governance Futures Lab is, I think it might be the oldest lab that we've created at the Institute. It started about 8 or 9 years ago. And our goal really is to educate and arm a movement of social inventors, people that are inspired and tasked and responsible and mandated to help rethink and recreate our systems of government. So we want to arm that movement, hopefully, create, catalyze, educate, arm a movement of social inventors with tools and concepts to help build better governing systems. And we've done that through things like the toolkit we created, which is a step-by-step process for redesigning government. So if you want to know how to do it, here's one way that we think, a structured way to think through from kind of beginning to end, what do you need to think about? What are the order? How do you even begin such a crazy, audacious idea as redesigning or reconstituting our society? So we have some structures and platforms and participatory processes that we use to do that. We also have been working with the U.S. Conference of Mayors for the last few years, doing foresight training for mayors and city leaders. And we created a series of posters from the future, working with different mayors around the world. And here's some examples from Rochester Hills, Michigan, and Tempe, Arizona, and Oakland. And we work with Santa Fe and Austin and Portland and other places. So we are kind of opportunistic in finding ways to help futurize those working in government and to help provide structures for thinking through at a grassroots level, how do we get involved in not just voting or not just these kind of one-off ways to participate in politics, but really rethinking the architecture of our political systems. Okay, Alana is going to talk through the structure and outline what's in the playbook, and then we'll go diving into some of the examples.
Great. So in this playbook that we're going to walk through today, it contains risk zones, scenarios, the decision tree tool that Jake mentioned we're going to practice, some discussion questions, and further reading. So diving into that, what are these? We have 5 risk zones contained in this playbook, which are areas that we've identified as either current or will be threats, significant threats, as well as areas that are ripe for technological disruption. So through the research and through interviews that we did with a number of people working in government, we identified these 5 risk zones that we think people need to be paying attention to, and those are law enforcement, public health, climate, AI, and equity and inclusion. So within each of these risk zones, we have 2 scenarios that we've created, one near term from 2022 and one of a further out future from 2032. And each of these scenarios kind of paints a picture of where you might find yourself in that year within this risk zone. And then what are some decisions that you might have to make that inherently include some dilemmas or choosing between trade-offs or choosing between things that might kind of butt up against your civil service and civic values. So to help with the decision-making architecture, we created this decision tree, which is actually an evolution of the futures wheel, which we kind of simplified and bifurcated to this binary positive and negative choice points of what do you do in these scenarios. And so the idea is to kind of think through what are the potential positive and negative outcomes of your decision making, of your policy making, and what are some ways that you can anticipate unintended consequences of the policies that you're creating, of the regulations that you're making, and either remedy them or kind of use that hindsight that you've gained to create different and better policies. And then after each of the decision trees, there are a series of questions for consideration that you can use within your teams, within your departments, to think a little bit more deeply about these scenarios. And in particular, if this scenario or if this issue area doesn't feel immediately relevant or tangible for you or your department, these questions are designed to help you think about how you might apply that decision-making architecture to things that you are actually dealing with on a day-to-day basis. So that's the basics of what's in the playbook. We think the most exciting part comes from actually walking through it and walking through the scenarios and using the decision tree. So Jake is going to walk us through an example.
Yeah, and we have these scenarios, and I will say as a bit of background, we built the playbook for ethical tech governance kind of on the back or the complement to the ethical OS piece that IFTF did. Sam Woolley and Jane McGonigal, colleagues of ours at the Institute for the Future, working with and targeted toward an audience of tech companies. How do you get ahead of your products being used and abused and destroying democracy or creating injustice? You know, how do you think ahead so that the things that you're building don't end up having these negative outcomes? And we presented that actually at one of the meetings of the U.S. Conference of Mayors in Austin, and it really resonated with the mayors and city leaders. And so inspired by that, we thought, okay, let's do a version of this toolkit or process of thinking through the ethical implications and adding foresight to that for city leaders, for mayors, and for civil servants. So that is kind of the way we ended up creating and designing it in certain ways, and why the scenarios are crafted the way they are, kind of as an audience of civil servants or people in policy making these decisions and doing that from a government point of view. So we have, as Alana said, we have 5 different zones. One of them is law enforcement, and this is a near-term scenario that we created. I think these issues will be familiar to many people. It's in the news every day, and that was kind of part of our design as well, is to do something that's now-ish, something you might face at this point or have faced these ethical choices right now, and then other things that push further but have the same structure of thinking so that we can get ahead of those things. So law enforcement. So here's the kind of scenario that you would be working with in this case. So your county recently began using a facial recognition system to identify individuals caught on surveillance cameras. Recently, on the recommendation of this system, your department arrested a Black resident at his place of work, drove him to a detention center, and interrogated him for several hours before determining the system had misidentified him. You can find many examples of this kind of scenario already. So activist groups are lobbying to, yes, coded bias, Sheila, too many examples of this. So in this scenario, activist groups are lobbying to ban every police force in the state from using any facial recognition technology. In this scenario, we're not trying to add any value ahead of time for this, but facing choices is what we're trying to put forward here with these scenarios. So to counter this movement, you've been tasked with proposing publicly available, legally enforceable guidelines on the acquisition, implementation, and oversight of the algorithms that facial recognition systems use when making criminal justice decisions in your county. So these are the sort of ethical choices. Maybe you're being told, maybe you agree or disagree with this, but this is your task. And so how would you go through about this? How would you think through this? Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the decision tree, as we said, is kind of a limited, in a way, a little bit more confined or directed version of the futures wheel, where you think about what if questions. So if you do this, what happens next? If that happens, what happens next? And we have this positive, negative outcome in this case to think about, just to put a finer point on thinking through what are some of the things that could happen that you hope for or intend with this, and what are some of the things that maybe you wouldn't want to see happen, and how do you deal with those things? So we went through with a colleague of ours to think through this and run through the tool itself. And so in this case, the suggestion was, okay, let's create an oversight office, a sort of citizen group that would approve any AI and facial recognition warrant or arrest. So it has to go through, before you make an arrest or issue a warrant, it has to be vetted by an advisory group. All right, what's a positive thing that could happen? Well, if it goes well, this oversight office will prevent false arrests based on algorithmic bias. Okay, great. And then we go over here. What's something negative that might happen? Well, it might drastically slow down police work and become too expensive and therefore rarely used. So maybe the benefits of this technology are thwarted because of this bureaucratic oversight. And then from there you build on. So what would you do? And then we ask, okay, what if now? What would you do? What would you do if it slowed down and made too expensive this tool? What you could do possibly is examine court systems to see how warrants are being issued. You could review other programs and that could be leading to a drop in crime instead. So it's kind of taking a more systematic systems view of that, and maybe there's other angles to doing police work. So that's how we go through, and you can see each one of these prompts helps you think systematically through, okay, let me do this, let me do that. And then, ending up at the top, what are things you could have done differently in the first place? Maybe you go back now and think about that first choice and say, okay, let me get ahead of this. What could I have done differently from the start that maybe wouldn't have led to some of these negative outcomes that we had to backtrack and fix later? So that's the idea. That's the kind of thinking process that we're trying to scaffold here with this tool. And as we said, in the structure of this, you're given questions. So you go through this process, and then through through these prompts and kind of through the lens of civil service values, are the choices we're making at every point kind of embedding those values that we had? One of the things in our interviews and research that we found, which was kind of very interesting, and I don't know if it's surprising or not, but we talked to many people working in government and civil service, and they were saying, yes, public values, civil service values are, they're kind of so there that they're not talked about. And therefore you're expected to do this, but we don't have a systematic way of going through this. And I think what we're trying to do with this is contribute to that. Okay, if you have these values, how can you use them in a systematic way to think through your decisions if you don't have a formal process for doing that? So this is hopefully a contribution to that, which would be a more systematic or more structured process for doing that kind of thinking through civil service values and ethics. Okay, Ilana, you want to take them through? It's your turn now, everyone.
Great, thank you, Jake. So as I mentioned, we had a number of different risk zones. So now we're going to take you into the risk zone of climate in the year 2032. And again, we recognize that not every person working in government or in every department is going to have to be addressing each of these issues and each of these risk zones that we're talking about. So trying to embed within the scenarios a number of different questions and values and ethics, as Jake was mentioning, and kind of thinking about how do the decisions that we're making impact or reinforce those values. So we'll talk through a little bit what that means. In this particular scenario in 2032, citizen scientists have created an open source pollution map of your city, along with these early warning drones that alert residents when pollution levels rise, telling them to stay inside. So recently, these drones swarmed a neighborhood with a warning before the city informed residents of potential toxic exposure. So understandably, people are upset. They feel like the city has betrayed them. There's a little bit of a loss of trust that the city's not telling them what's going on in their neighborhood before these drones do. So the Department of Public Health is proposing a new lengthy regulatory process for the drones, that the drones have to be approved before they can be used. And residents are protesting this because they say they're not getting health information when they need it from the Department of Public Health. And so they want these open source drones. So you, as a regulator at the Department of Public Health, what do you do? What do you do about this? So we're going to walk through this decision tree, which is welcoming us in with an aloha and a hello. So we're going to ask you to just put in the chat, and Jake's going to call out some of the things that you're responding in this scenario where the Department of Public Health wants to regulate these drones, but the citizens who feel like they're getting more accurate information from these open source drones are protesting. What do you, as a regulator with the Department of Public Health, do? So feel free to just put that in your ideas in the chat.
So we have one, I believe, from Aaron here. Regulation could prevent possible panic due to errors in notification algorithms. It's kind of I think, an observation on that. Are there other choices? Maybe we should go. You want to go back to the scenario? Okay, from Sheila, we have call an investigatory panel with all represented, investigate the quality of health information and communications. Maybe that would be a good initial start to this proposed idea.
Great, thank you, Sheila. So we have a regulatory panel, or an investigatory panel, excuse me, that's going to look at the results. So what is a positive outcome that might occur from creating this panel?
Yes, add it to the chat. So what are the positive outcomes, the best case outcomes for this proposed idea? So more participation involvement. The drones could become more efficient at detecting pollution and alerting the public. Create new outcomes. Transparency fosters trust with residents. Lots of minds considering the benefits for a wider population. The panel will be more transparent.
Great. These are great. It seems like there's a lot of very immediate positive outcomes thinking about this investigatory panel. So now we're going to switch our mental gears, which is part of the point of this decision tree, is to force us to think in kind of two very binary directions. So what are some negative outcomes that might happen because of this investigatory panel?
Polluters shift their emissions to avoid drone detection, right? Yeah, a discussion of who wasn't able to participate in the panel, who was left out. Selection becomes a politicized battle. Yes, thanks, Vanessa. Governments start using drones for other purposes, right? Yeah, they're not, what else can they, what other data is being gathered and how can that be used or abused? Industries could lobby to heavily regulate the drones and render them useless, borderline useless, right? These are great. The negatives are really coming, right? Yeah, or even the perception that the drones are doing that, right?
So let's go with that. The last one that you just read about governments using drones for other data collection purposes.
Right, or even the perception, which was part of it, which could undermine this as well. Even just the hint or the conspiracies that might be associated with this, that the government is using it to spy on people or gather other data.
Yes, thank you. So the use of it and the perception of it. So you, again, in your shoes as a regulator with the Department of Public Health, what do you do in response to this potential negative outcome?
Yeah, how would you respond to that? Okay, people, either government is using it or people perceive that the government is gathering data and using it as a surveillance mechanism. How would you deal with that? Could do a series of public information notices on the use of drones. What's their purpose, right? Drone data could be available open source. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, anyone can look at it. The optics release guidelines on use. Find out what the prevalent narrative is for the drones in the public and create communication plans based on that. Set up an oversight board, inviting civil society orgs. You know what I love about this? Sometimes there's like oversight, infinite regress that happens, right? Who's policing the police, who's overseeing the overseers, and all of that. Which is why I love the kind of ethical dilemmas and the choices that this process brings out. Like, how do you deal with that? Do we just keep adding other layers, or is there other ways to look at that? So just thinking through those layered consequences helps us see that sometimes. Yeah, clear information about what happens with the data, consequences for regulators if they abuse it, right? Yeah, so some real teeth to that. Look at how bad actors could hack the system. Yeah, even black hat hackers, which some governments and organizations use to see how the system can be abused or broken into, or do that ahead of time.
Right, great. So these are great, and as you can see, they have kind of taken us multiple layers past this initial decision of creating an investigatory panel. So what we would then do is think about, okay, what could you have done differently in the first place to anticipate some of these negative outcomes? What would you have put in place? And we kind of walk through it that way. But I want it for the last kind of interactive part, I want to bring it back to the positive side, because what we also want to think about is, things that have seem like they have an initial positive outcome might also have a negative outcome for certain populations or down the line. So when we thought about what positive outcomes might occur, we would then prompt, okay, well, what are some negative outcomes that might occur because of these positive outcomes? So just some thoughts on, I know we had a lot of great ones about improving trust and transparency, but what we want to force you really to think about is what are some negative outcomes that might occur from that. And some of those conversations came up in box number 3 of certain people aren't included in the panel, or changing the way that the drones operate, certain lobbying effects. So I want to open that up to conversation too, to just enter in the chat. Again, what are some negative outcomes that might occur after this initial positive outcome?
One size fits all might not be the case. Some language groups excluded. Yeah, exclusion I think is a big part. Yeah, participatory is one of the positive outcomes, but how wide is too wide? And then, you know, if everyone is involved, when does it become too unwieldy? That's always an issue with government participation.
Yeah, great. So these are great. And as you can see, we went really quickly from trust to lack of inclusion, or from openness to not being able to have control or efficiency. And so these are some of the conversation points that we really want to encourage people to have about these trade-offs, about these kind of dilemmas that are embedded within each of the decisions. So I think you can get a sense of how the decision tree works. You could obviously continue to have these brainstorm conversations for multiple hours or weeks on end about policy decisions. And then again, after we go through these multiple layers of consequence and potential outcomes, we have these questions for consideration. So as examples with this one, you know, if the wisdom of the crowd is trustworthy, is it your place to regulate how it spreads information? So again, this question of openness and open source to regulation, or as a government agent, how would you work with the citizen scientist to rebuild trust in your agency? And so again, we saw some of those conversations around, well, the openness or the investigatory panel can create trust, but then there are issues of inclusion and openness. So really, again, wanting to encourage these conversations within your departments.
And, you know, just to add a little meta commentary on this, you can go through all of this and then get to the point where you go back and say, this doesn't work. I mean, that's a perfectly fine outcome. It's to try to get ahead of these things and not learn the hard way, as any foresight work does. So the process is really to do that, to look at the outcomes and then to weigh those choices. Like, there are going to be negative outcomes for almost any policy, right? There's going to be people left out, or, you know, those at a disadvantage for certain policies. So getting ahead of that, thinking through that, you know, there's a question from Bogdana earlier, which was really great. It's, you know, what is the process of going through? Does each civil servant go through it by themselves, or they do it collectively? And then, you know, how do you process that information? I think you could use this individually. Yes, that's one use case. Another is to do it in your group, your policy group, or with city leaders and decision makers. I really think, and we talked about this with a lot of our interviewees, when policies are made, when decisions are made, there are these trade-offs that are happening, whether they're made explicit or not. I think this could be a great tool to go through with citizens to say, here's what we thought and how we got there, and here are the trade-offs that we made, or let's go through it in a kind of public way to think through this, and where are the places that we're willing to give a little bit of, you know, the ethical trade-offs, or some of the you know, who's left out, and try to deal with that. But we know there's going to be issues, and there's no perfect answer. But, you know, I could see this being a much more transparent way to talk through these ethical issues, not only for foresight, but for public communication and buy-in. I think it could be used in that sense as well.
Yeah, thank you.
So we're gonna go. John is gonna talk about the what we have. This playbook is publicly available. You can use it. We designed it to be self-facilitated, and that's why, you know, speaking of trade-offs, some of the trade-offs with the kinds of things you could think through, the different implications in a broad sense, we kind of narrowed it into this, you know, limited but hopefully enablingly constrained version of positive and negative to help think through that in a systematic way. So it's there. It's going to be given to you, I think, in an email, and we can, you know, share that with you, and you're welcome to share it with anyone. But we also want to provide facilitation services. We can run workshops with you. We can help work with a group or with your organization or agency. So we have some offerings here where we can come in and collaborate with you to think through this and use the tool for different occasions.
Thanks, Jake. Yeah, as Jake mentioned, that the playbook itself is free, and we will be sending that as part of the follow-up email. But there are 3 offerings that we would like to walk through briefly and answer any questions that you might have if you would like to implement this playbook within your own organization. There are 2 different workshop options, a half day and a 1.5 day. And as you can see on the slide, the half day workshop would simply be where our group comes in and gives an introduction or an overview of the playbook and risk zones and scenarios. We would allow you and provide you with dedicated time to practice using the tools, both the decision tree and additional prompt questions that you could use with small breakouts. And this would be accompanied with IFTF expert facilitators. I have a feeling you're looking at 2 of them right now. The second offering is the 1.5 day offering. So this is much more of a specific deep dive into the playbook. And this is, everything that we mentioned above. So that introduction and overview and sort of how to do it. But we will take you deeply into 2 of the risk zones specifically. We'll walk through that decision tree and with the feedback and the input from the facilitators on site. And even more than that, there will be much more hands-on application. So you can practice using these methods and applying them to your own work with the feedback and input again from the IFTF facilitators. Both of these sessions, we can provide various discounts for government agencies and other entities. So please talk to us or follow up with that. The half-day session would run somewhere between the $20,000 to $30,000 range, and the 1.5 day workshop is more in the $60,000 to $75,000 range. Again, what we propose is that you let us know what your level of interest is. We can provide a specific one-on-one follow-up call and meeting with you to walk through how you can use it specifically for your organization. And then the last piece is a custom speech. So we can create a customized speech for your organization where Jake or Ilana or someone else here at the Institute can come and give that speech to your group. And that is in that $5,000 range. So those are the 3 offerings that we wanted to propose to this group. And again, we'll outline these in that follow-up email, and hopefully we'll have an opportunity to talk with you specifically about your needs and how IFTF can help with this playbook. And now wanted to walk through some of the questions that we received during the webinar. So again, feel free to keep typing them in as they come up. One that we wanted to tip off with was from Frances. And she asked, what have you done or do to make certain no bias is present with this process and the questions asked? The main premise is there's something inherently wrong with protesting.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, these we're trying to as best we can simulate what a civil servant might face or a policymaker might face. And, we're not necessarily trying to make a value judgment on protest or not ahead of time. We want to think that we want to provide a scenario, a plausible use case for civil servants to think through that. So, we don't have necessarily an opinion about the protest, but it's something that might happen, right? And maybe the protesters have a valid point that you need to think through, and then to bring that in to the decision tree process. Okay, what are the negative outcomes? Expanded protest or more aggressive protest. How do we deal with that? So, or maybe the protesters have a valid point. You make a decision that addresses some of their complaints ahead of time through this. So we're just trying to lay out the kind of agents and dynamics of a plausible situation, and then the decision tree there is really there to help think through those what if questions and to keep doing that and looking at the layers of intended and unintended consequences that could happen. And yes, Garrett, protest and riot and insurrection, these terms are very fluid, and the way we have typically thought about them and stereotyped them, I think are changing very rapidly as well.
Great, thanks, Jake. And actually another question from Francis asked, so when you do this, do you have multiple positive and negative outcomes, which you create something like a risk log to mitigate?
Yeah, I don't know, Lana, if you want to take that one.
Yeah, I think part of the like Jake was saying, when we get to the end of the decision tree and go through these questions, part of the idea is, okay, well, what do you do now? How do you take this foresight? How do you take this kind of um, uh, future hindsight and apply it to what you're doing now? And part of that can be, yes, looking at these at the various risks. If you want to create a risk log and kind of weigh them against each other and think about how does that impact your decision making now, and how are you going to weight some of these risks versus the others, and think about these trade-offs, think about the dilemmas, and is that going to affect your policy decision? Is that going to change the policy decision that you're making? So we don't have a specific chart for logging these risks, but I think that's a really great way of putting it, because that is essentially what you're doing every time you think about the potential negative outcomes of your initial decision, or even the negative outcomes of a positive outcome, is logging those risks and then using them to weigh against the decisions that you're making or the dilemmas that you're trying to address.
So also imagine just in that use case of the climate and the drones and the data gathering, one of the negative outcomes was that people feel like the government is going to gather other data, and that there's this sort of conspiracy side of things that may be generated, right? Whether it's valid or not. I think there's a lot of valid about how the powerful use data. But imagine you've weighed these trade-offs and you say, okay, yeah, we think this is still valuable. It's a really good thing, even though it might cause some of these issues. Get ahead of that narrative. Start building your campaign, your anti-conspiracy campaign ahead of time before you ever launch it, or engage groups that you think might have skepticism toward it ahead of time. So, I think these kind of things help you not only, maybe make different decisions, but prepare to launch in a way, or to engage different groups and create processes that will alleviate potential barriers and hangups and backlash that might happen ahead of time. Get ahead of that.
Great. Thanks. Thank you both. Question from Ashish. The question is a sidebar question. When working with city officials, how are you navigating their tendency to retain control versus having openness to be more experimental or collaborative, learning-oriented decision-making? I ask, considering the background of trust deficit and quasi-authoritarian or adversarial governance behavior.
I'm going to pass that to Alana too. And take a first crack at
it. That's a great question. So the first way that I would answer that is, I think similar to what Jake said about using this with citizens to kind of establish that open rapport and see where each group is coming from, and kind of see your different priorities and how you would decide to how you might decide to do something, or what your priority is based on where you're coming from. I think that's just as valuable internally, and to kind of see where those edges and boundaries are of what can be open, where there can be innovation, where there can be creative prototyping, and who has the autonomy to do that within a government. And sometimes there might be somebody at a lower level who has the ideas, who has the desire to do something, but they run up against the structure of the bureaucracy and the red tape, and they can't make those decisions. And so they have, if you're walking through this with a department or with an elected, you can kind of see where people's different edges are in terms of what they're able to do and how they're able to make decisions. And so, of course, that walking through a decision tree isn't necessarily going to overcome an authoritarian government, but I think it might help within a department or within an agency, or even across agencies, of getting a bit of an understanding of where some of these decisions or innovations or prototypes might actually take place, where there's openness for it, where there's space for it, and how you can get creative with doing some of these things.
Thanks, Ilana. I had a handful of questions that I'll sort of try to combine here, but the general theme is, who would be the best candidates to take a workshop like this? In other words, what types of organizations or people or roles or job titles would be the best fit, and kind of what is the ideal size? How many people within the workshop?
Yeah, very good practical questions. I mean, we wanted this to target government workers, policymakers, decision makers, but we also wanted it to be, as best we could, applicable to civil servants working in different roles. But I would say, having been spurred by mayors, we were thinking about kind of key decision makers as one audience: city managers, the people that are doing policy, city councils, chief technology officers, internet security types that might be working and making these decisions, looking at outcomes, looking at, if I roll a policy out, what are the impacts going to be? Even, as really sort of to highlight in this conversation, public relations and the messaging that goes along with a rollout of policy too. This is very important as part of that communications side of things as well. So, broadly, anyone working in the civil service who are wrestling and making these decisions and kind of crafting policy, from the top to other people in layers of the bureaucracy that are implementing and rolling this out. Ideal size, I hesitate to put hard numbers on things, but I tend to like a kind of working group in the 15 to 25 range, I have to say. But as we said, you could do this by yourself. You could think through this on your own, or you could have it as a kind of public meeting. I could see this being, implemented in a virtual setting where people could comment on each one of these things, and you could kind of roll it out in a virtual way where there could be dozens or hundreds of people contributing in an asynchronous kind of way. So hopefully, as we said, it's made to and designed to live on its own. But we can see these other use cases where you could come together in a sort of condensed way and do it in a room, or maybe spread it out asynchronously and virtually. All of those, I think, are viable with this.
Great, thanks, Jake. Question from Elizabeth: how do you help policymakers use their values to weigh risks, or is that something you leave to them? Smiley face.
In our research and interviews, the civil service values, going back, 80 years and being written in these old British tomes about integrity and fairness and all of those things, they hold true in a way, but we didn't want to overprescribe exactly what those are, because they'll be slightly different. So to answer your question is, your values should weigh in on the kind of ethical choices. What are the trade-offs? What are you willing to accept as this decision? Are you willing to accept some manner of non-participation to get this rolled out because this is so important, right? Or do you need to go a different way because your values say that's too much, we're not going to do that, it's too unfair for this, or it might lead to less trust and lack of integrity for what we're doing. So yeah, those are kind of embedded in the ethical thinking that each group would bring to those choices and those trade-offs.
Got it. Thanks, Jake. Quick housekeeping note: we are at time, so understand if you do need to jump and then go to your next meeting for the day. But we do have a few more questions, so we will continue to answer those. And again, this will be in the video recap as well. So I just want to give you a heads up on the time.
Yeah, for all of those that are leaving, thank you so much. And yeah, we're going to stay on for a few more questions. And thanks again to TNGARI Silverton Foundation here in Austin. And hopefully this will live on in many different cases, and hopefully you find it very useful.
All right.
Let's get into some of these other.
Yeah, Jake. I had another from Bogdana asked, I'm curious about the risk zones. Do you think the risk zones affect the decision tree structure in some way because of the different nature of the risks?
I think that's an interesting question. The decision tree itself is designed to be applicable across all risk zones, ones that we've considered for this particular playbook and any that might come up in the future. So ideally, it's a tool that was created neutrally so that it can be applied to a number of different risk zones and issues and threats and opportunities that come up. Again, with the idea being that we really want to encourage or force people to think about both positive and negative outcomes of something. And so structuring it that way allows us to get into those nuances of these zones, of the risks, of the threats that we're facing.
Got it. Here's one. It's anonymous, but how far e-governance can achieve fairness and accountability in our communities? And how can we use e-governance to strengthen risk management?
Another good question. I mean, I think our default setting is very skeptical about technology silver bullets, and e-governance, has seen great advances with participation, with speed of government, with how information is gathered and disseminated. Estonia is always brought up as a great example of how do you integrate that a kind of digital version, digital transformation of governance. Lots of positive benefits there, but adding E to a broken bureaucracy is not going to work either, or a corrupt one, or so it takes a sort of goodwill and commitment to put these into practice. And even still, data overload. We've seen that just having more information doesn't necessarily lead to better outcomes. Oh yeah, we're going to be transparent, but that data can be manipulated. It can be reconceived. All of those things happen once it gets out into the wild and woolly public sphere. It's open game, but just basic stuff, speeding up bureaucratic processes. Do I need to get pulled over sorry, for a speeding ticket? Those kind of things. Maybe we don't want those processes speed up, but I do want to get my driver's license faster. I want to get my fees paid, or my license to do other things in a quicker fashion, where I don't have to go down to some sort of long line to work in. So those kind of efficiencies, I think, are a nice promise of e-government. But it's not some sort of magic transformation that automatically happens without a whole other things happening around the system.
And just embedded in that question, the person who asked it was asking about fairness and accountability. And of course, whenever you're talking about anything digital, there are questions of access, there are questions of, who has broadband or who has the ability to access or use the technology. And then, of course, any platform that is built upon which the e-governance system is being more efficient or is being used, no platform is actually neutral, because people built the platform. So there is likely going to be some sort of challenge or bias or some sort of issue embedded in the way that the platform itself was built. And so there then become this whole slew of questions of how do we consider how those platforms are being built so that the e-government system or the different ways that we're using it do have that fairness and accountability built in, or have some checks along the way to make sure that we are accounting for those things.
Yeah, I love the example from some folks we know in Brazil who have used the government reimbursement process, which is open to the public for elected officials and civil servants. So they took that information and started to suss out corruption that was happening and double billing. So like, okay, yes, Mr. DaCosta, you charged your lunch in Sao Paulo at 12:01, and you also charged this other thing in Brasilia 10 minutes later for another $300 or whatever. So that kind of accountability, if we have that data, there's some oversight that could happen as well. I like that part of it. Maybe weed out a little bit of corruption.
I had another question from Ashish. What was the biggest facilitation adjustment you all needed to make during these sessions? These seem like very valuable points of contact to participate and support leaders.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm so glad you asked it, because we really went through an evolution with this. We had the ethical OS, which existed, which had a structure to it. We worked with mayors. We talked to them about what messages are resonating with them. What do they need to think through this? And as we've kind of intimated here, the original idea was to do a futures wheel, which is, if you've seen it, it's just like, what's the prime mover? What thing is happening? Okay, what's the first level? What's going to happen, right? If you shut down the internet, what are the things that are going to happen to people? How are they, they're going to communicate, they're going to protest. Okay, so you go to the next level. If that happens, then what happens? And then the third level, if that happens, what happens next? And so it's kind of an open-ended way of doing that. And when we were doing play testing with this and demos for people, and we just gave them that tool to say, okay, basically what you've done, but think through that. People it was too slippery and a little bit too amorphous to think through. All right, I'm going to do an oversight committee. I don't know. some people had a hard time self-facilitating that, and we wanted this to be something that kind of lives on its own. So the trade-off that we made of doing this positive and negative is really to constrain that. And of course, it's more complicated than that. I mean, for us, like, oh, are we putting it too much in a box to think about positive and negative? But I think it helps. I think it just helps you think through in a way that just kind of forces your hand a little bit to make it a little bit more constrained and a little bit more directed to think through those kind of consequences. But still being useful, and I think still reflecting a kind of plausible reality of how things might go. So that was our trade-off. We have a thing at the Institute called the Foresight Engine, which was an online participatory forecasting tool, which had one of the architectures of that was you had a scenario, and then you start thinking about what is kind of a dark thing that could happen and what's a positive thing that could happen. So that was in our mind as well. If you want to go back into the mental weeds of where we came up with this, but yeah, that's the idea, is to limit it enough to make it useful and self-facilitated, but not so limited that it doesn't reflect reality to some degree.
Great, and just we'll finish with these last couple of questions, which are again more of a practical nature. But so folks wanted to know who would run or facilitate these workshops, and are they remote or in person, and what would each of them look like in practice?
Well, Jake and I would facilitate them at the beginning, and we would work with you closely to figure out exactly what your needs are. We could do them in person. That would be very exciting. It's been a while, but we could do them in person. We could do them remotely. And we really like them to be hands-on with small breakout groups, so you can have these deeper discussions and get into the nuance of the questions and the dilemmas and the trade-offs and the values and the ethics that aren't necessarily explicit but are so important to be thinking about when you're talking about these questions. So we depending on what the structure is, whether that's the half day or the day and a half, we would again dive into some of the risk zones and walk through the decision tree and really spend time with each decision point about what are the implications, what does this mean, what might you have done differently, how do you change your policy, and then if it is the day and a half, we would get a little deeper into who are you and what are you working on, what are the things that are most relevant or most urgent for your department or for your city or for your municipality. And so how do you then take this thought process and this decision-making architecture and apply it to the specific issues and policies that you're considering and working on right now?
Great. Well, thank you. I think we'll wrap it up now. Jake, Ilana, thank you very, very much for walking us through the playbook. Thanks to everyone that joined us and is still on the call, because we are a few minutes over. But yes, in closing, thanks to Tingari Silverton, who funded this project, and Lane Becker, who helped to co-author it. And we would very much like to work with you and your organizations and set up a workshop with you. So I'll remind you that we will send an email that will cover all of this information as well as the video. And oftentimes, if you are interested in doing this, please forward that video on to other folks in your office, your team, your colleagues, so you can all get on board with this. Happy to have individual meetings with you as well. So we'll look forward to communicating post-webinar. But again, thanks to everyone for joining. And most importantly, Jake, Ilana, thank you.
Thanks, John, and thanks everybody for your great questions. I mean, this was our launch meeting. We had good confidence, we'd done the work, but to see it, in the wild and get reactions to it, and your questions were great and deep and challenging, and we really appreciate your time today. Thank you so much. Reach out if you want to talk more.
Thanks, all.